Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to uncover the hidden machinery behind economic booms and busts.
Yeah, we're really getting into the underlying architecture of time, money, and how things are physically made in a modern economy.
Exactly. And to do this, we're drawing on a single comprehensive source. It's a fascinating framework detailed in Roger W. Garrison's book, Time and Money, The Macroeconomics of Capital Structure.
Right, and it's a framework that, well, it forces you to completely rethink how you view a healthy economy.
It really does. And I think that's exactly where we need to start. Because, think about what happens when you watch the news.
Oh, yeah, the little ticker scrolling across the bottom of the screen.
Right. And the economic updates are almost always exactly the same. You see the jobs numbers or the total money supply or like overall consumer
It
spending.
feels a lot like reading the gauges on a giant machine.
Yes. You see the needle for consumer spending move up and you just assume you know exactly what the machine is doing. You think, well, the economy must be doing great.
I mean, it gives a comforting sense of control, right? If unemployment is down and spending is up, the natural assumption is that the engine is just running perfectly.
But staring at those top-level aggregated numbers, it can completely blind us to the actual physical reality of how an economy grows over time.
Definitely. And there's this famous critique from the Nobel laureate Robert Solow that highlights this exact problem. He pointed out a major weakness in modern mainstream macroeconomics.
And what was that?
Well, he said there is a severe lack of what he called real coupling between the short-run picture and the long-run picture.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does that lack of coupling actually mean for you and me?
Essentially, in the short run, traditional economics tends to treat the economy like a snapshot.
Like a photograph.
Right. And in the snapshot, especially if the economy is recovering from a recession, consumption and investment can seemingly move together. You stimulate demand, people buy more things, and factories build more machines.
Everything goes up all at once.
Exactly. But in the long run, when an economy is running at its full capacity, that magic trick just stops working.
Reality sets in.
Yeah, to actually grow sustainably, you cannot have everything at once. You have to trade one thing for another. I mean, you physically have to sacrifice consumption today to fund the investment for tomorrow.
And bridging that gap between the illusion of the short-term snapshot and the hard reality of long-term growth, that is what this deep dive is all about.
Right. We're going to explore how focusing only on short-term monetary policies can, silently and fundamentally distort the long-term physical structure of an entire economy.
So, to understand how this framework fixes that gap, we first have to look at why traditional economics missed it in the first place. Right?
Yes, we do. And that shift requires us to stop looking at the economy purely through the lens of labor and total spending. We have to instead look at it through the lens of capital and time.
Which brings up a really vivid analogy from the material. It describes the dominant 20th century view, specifically the view of John Maynard Keynes.
Oh, the wheelbarrow analogy.
Yes. Keynes essentially modeled the highly complex macroeconomy as a wheelbarrow. Now think about a wheelbarrow for a second.
It's a bucket on a single wheel.
Right. It's incredibly useful,
Yeah.
but it has zero internal balancing mechanism. Like if you just leave a loaded wheelbarrow alone, it tips over.
It's inherently unstable.
Exactly. So in this Keynesian view, to keep the wheelbarrow upright and moving forward, you need an external entity, specifically the government or a central bank.
They have to keep a firm, constant grip on both handles.
Yeah. One handle is fiscal policy, so government taxing and spending. And the other handle is monetary policy, manipulating the money supply. And the belief is that if the central planner lets go of those handles even for a second, the whole system crashes.
But the Austrian economic perspective, which is championed by thinkers like F.A. Hayek, offers a completely different visual.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this framework doesn't view the economy as a wheelbarrow. It views it more like a classical unicycle.
A unicycle. Now, a unicycle is obviously tricky to ride, but unlike a wheelbarrow, it actually balances itself.
Right. It doesn't need external hands holding it upright.
Assuming you know how to ride it, the unicycle balances through constant dynamic microadjustments. The rider shifts their weight, the pedals move.
And in the economy, those internal mechanisms are the natural interplay of relative prices, incomes, and interest rates.
And provided those internal mechanisms aren't tampered with, they do the work of keeping the economy moving forward.
Exactly. But to understand exactly how this unicycle balances, we need to introduce a new toolkit. There are 3 interconnected concepts from the text we need to look at.
Okay, let's start with the easiest one, the market for loanable funds. This is basically just the pool of investable resources in the economy, right?
Yeah, it's the savings sitting in bank vaults waiting to be lent out.
Makes sense. And that leads directly to the second concept, the production possibilities frontier, or the PPF.
Right, so imagine drawing a curved line on a graph. This line represents the absolute physical limit of what an economy can produce at any given moment.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
On one end of the line, you have maximum consumer goods. Everyone is buying shoes, cars, vacations. On the other end, you have maximum capital investment. So building factories, mining resources, developing software.
And the PPF shows us the hard reality of trade-offs.
Exactly. If the economy is operating at its maximum limit on that curved line, you simply cannot have infinite amounts of both. To get more investment for tomorrow, you physically have to give up some consumption today.
Which brings us to the third concept, and this is really the star of the show for this deep dive, the Hayekian triangle.
Yes.
To visualize this triangle, think about building a house. You don't just snap your fingers and instantly have a finished home ready to live in.
No, it happens in sequential stages over a long period of time.
Right. And the time dimension is what mainstream economics often ignores.
Yeah.
But it is everything in this framework. Let's walk through it. First, someone has to mine the copper for the wiring.
Which takes a lot of time and effort.
But raw copper ore isn't really worth that much to someone buying a house. So that is the early stage. Then, someone else manufactures that copper into electrical wire.
The value of the material just went up.
Exactly. Then there's distribution, framing, plumbing, and finally, you hit the retail stage where a finished, highly valuable house is sold.
And that sequence perfectly explains the shape of the triangle.
Yes. The horizontal axis along the bottom is time, the sequence of all these stages of production. And the vertical axis represents the physical value of the goods at that specific stage.
Right. So at the very beginning with the raw copper, the vertical value is very low.
But as you move through time, you're adding labor and processing, so the value grows higher and higher, creating a slope that forms a right triangle pointing to the left.
And the final, tallest point of the triangle is that finished consumer good. Capital isn't just this weird blob of money. It is a highly structured, time-consuming sequence of physical goods in process.
Okay, so by stretching investment out into this triangle, we can finally see how an economy actually grows in a healthy, sustainable way.
Right, because real growth doesn't just happen by magic. And it definitely doesn't happen just because the government prints more money.
No.
It happens when intertemporal preferences change.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
I know, it's a fancy way of saying. Growth happens when people collectively decide to save more of their income today so they can consume more tomorrow.
And the framework uses a great acronym for this concept. SUFS. SUFS. Saving up for something.
I love that acronym.
Me too. I find it incredibly helpful because it totally shifts how we're usually taught to think about saving. Because
Yeah.
you look at the wheelbarrow mentality, there's this pervasive fear called the paradox of thrift.
Right. The worry that if everyone suddenly decides to save their money, that money just vanishes into a black hole.
Exactly. People think, well, no one is buying anything at the stores, so the retail sector collapses and the whole economy just grinds to a halt.
But SUFS reminds us that saving is never a black hole. When you save money, you aren't declaring that you never want to buy anything ever again.
You're just waiting.
Right. Saving implies a very definite intent to consume later. It's a deliberate shifting of your consumption through time.
So how does the unicycle actually balance when people do this? Let's walk through the chain reaction.
Okay, so when everyday people decide to save more, they deposit that money into banks. This increases the supply of loanable funds.
So now the banks have vaults overflowing with cash that they need to lend out.
Yeah.
What happens to the price of borrowing that money?
The interest rate naturally falls. I mean, the banks have to lower rates to attract borrowers.
Basic supply and demand.
Ah,
But here is where we connect it back to the Hayekian triangle and specifically to a concept called the time discount.
this is a crucial piece.
Right. Why does a lower interest rate matter so much more to a copper mine than, say, a local coffee shop?
It comes down to the time value of money. If you own a coffee shop, you buy milk and coffee beans, and you sell a latte the very next day.
Super fast.
Right. Your turnaround time is incredibly fast, so the interest rate on a short-term loan doesn't actually impact your business model very much. But if you are building a new copper mine,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
you might have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars over 10 years before you sell a single ounce of copper.
So you are carrying that massive debt for a decade.
Precisely. Long-term projects are mathematically hypersensitive to interest rates. When interest rates drop because everyday people are saving more, the cost of doing business in those early stages of the Hayekian Triangle, the mining, the heavy manufacturing, the R&D suddenly becomes much cheaper.
And much more profitable.
Yes.
And just look at the harmony there. Consumers are saving because they want to buy things later.
Hmm.
And because they saved, interest rates fell, which allows producers to fund massive, long-term projects that will eventually finish producing goods.
Later.
Exactly. The structure of production perfectly aligns with the desires of the consumers.
But, we do have to address the paradox of thrift fear you mentioned earlier. What about the retail workers in the short term?
Right. If I stop buying a latte every day to put that $5 in savings, my local barista might lose their job. Doesn't the economy shrink?
It creates a localized drop in demand, yeah? Labor is what economists call a derived demand. The demand for baristas is derived from the demand for coffee.
Okay.
However, the internal balancing mechanism is at work. Because the interest rates have fallen and made early-stage projects highly profitable, the demand for labor in mining, manufacturing, and heavy engineering goes up significantly.
Ah, I see. So the wages in the retail sector might temporarily stagnate or dip, but the wages in the manufacturing and construction sectors rise.
Exactly. This relative wage shift naturally guides workers away from the late stages of the triangle and toward the early stages.
They leave the coffee shop and go work at the factory that manufactures espresso machines.
Right. They move exactly where they are needed to build the foundation for long-term growth. No
Yeah.
central planner has to tell them where to go. The interest rate does all the signaling.
Okay, so we've established that sustainable growth requires genuine saving to fund long-term projects. The unicycle balances. But what happens when a central bank tries to force this exact same growth, but without anyone actually saving a dime?
This is how the framework explains the illusion of growth, the artificial boom.
Let's look at the mechanics of this. How does a central bank artificially lower the interest rate? They don't just snap their fingers.
No, typically a central bank like the Federal Reserve will create new digital money out of thin air and use it to buy government bonds on the open market.
And this suddenly flushes the banking system with massive amounts of cash reserves.
Right. And the banks, desperate to lend this new money out, slash their interest rates.
On the surface, to a business owner, this looks exactly like the SUFS scenario we just discussed. The interest rate is incredibly low.
But the underlying reality is entirely different. There are no actual savings backing it up.
And this triggers a massive tug-of-war on the production possibilities frontier. Think about the two groups involved here. On one side, you have the consumers.
Yeah.
They haven't changed their habits at all. They didn't save up for something. They still want to consume at maximum capacity right now.
Yeah.
On the other side, you have the investors and entrepreneurs. They see this artificially cheap credit and think, amazing. The cost of borrowing is so low, it's the perfect time to build a massive 10-year infrastructure project.
The economy is suddenly being stretched in two opposite directions. It's being pushed completely beyond its physical, sustainable limits.
And the framework makes a really important distinction here. We often hear this called overinvestment, as if the economy is just doing too much of a good thing.
But the real danger is malinvestment. We are investing in the wrong things at the wrong time.
Right. Imagine we pour billions of dollars of cheap credit into building a massive nationwide fiber optic network that will take 10 years to complete.
That pulls huge amounts of labor, concrete, and copper into the early stages of the Hayekian Triangle.
But meanwhile, because consumers didn't actually save, consumer demand remains red hot. People still want to buy groceries, cars, finished houses.
So, strong consumer demand is simultaneously pulling resources into the late retail stages.
The triangle is literally being ripped apart at both ends. You're trying to build the roof of the house and the foundation of the house at the exact same time, but you simply don't have enough bricks for the walls in between.
The middle stages of production are completely hollowed out.
It's an architectural nightmare. And, just to be clear, we're simply imparting the mechanics of this specific economic framework here.
Right, we're not taking a policy stance on the Federal Reserve.
Definitely not. But according to this logic, this artificial boom leads to an absolutely inevitable bust.
Because eventually, the illusion shatters. The bricks run out. The real-world resource scarcities hit hard.
The fiber optic companies suddenly realize they can't afford the raw materials to finish the network because all those materials were already consumed by the booming retail sector.
The boom is exposed as mathematically impossible.
So what happens then?
Well, at this point, companies scramble for any capital they can find just to keep the lights on. This causes a wave of distress borrowing.
Which means real interest rates absolutely spike. And those massive long-term projects have to be abandoned halfway through. That is the bust. You are left with a landscape of half-finished fiber optic networks, empty foundations, and thousands of unemployed workers who were lured into industries that only made sense under the temporary illusion of cheap money.
Now, a very fair critique of this theory is brought up in the source text itself. The economist John Hicks challenged this whole Austrian framework with a really practical question.
I remember this. It's a great question.
He asked, if entrepreneurs are so smart, why do they keep falling for the fake interest rate?
Right. If they know the central bank is manipulating the money supply, why don't they just look past the illusion and ignore the cheap credit?
I love this part because it brings us to the knowledge problem. The critics assume that business owners have perfect, godlike macroeconomic information.
That they're constantly monitoring the total money supply.
Exactly. But if I'm a local lumberyard owner or a regional developer, I don't have a magical map with a giant red dot saying, you are here on the Hayekian Triangle.
No, you are on the ground. You are dealing with your specific suppliers and your specific local bank.
Right. I don't care what the Federal Reserve is doing in Washington. I just care that my local bank is suddenly offering me a 2% loan to expand my lumberyard.
Why wouldn't you take that? It makes perfect business sense from your localized perspective.
The material describes money as a loose joint in the economy. If we lived in a pure barter system, a fake boom would be literally impossible. You can't fake a surplus of physical wheat or steel.
But because we use money to represent those resources, that loose joint allows the illusion to persist just long enough for businesses to commit to these massive, irreversible projects.
By the time the lumberyard owner realizes the 2% interest rate didn't reflect real physical savings in the economy, the structural damage is already done.
Okay, so we've seen how a central bank, creating money out of thin air, severely warps the capital structure. But that naturally leads to another major question.
How fiscal policy impacts this?
Exactly. What happens when the government doesn't print the money, but simply borrows it directly out of the real economy?
The effects of direct government borrowing are equally profound on the intertemporal structure. Let's look at the scenario of deficit spending on something the text calls inert.
Okay, right. So imagine the government borrows $1 trillion to fund a massive war or to build an enormous national monument.
They are borrowing real resources, but they're spending them on things that do not produce future consumer goods.
When the Treasury goes into the market and borrows that much money, they massively increase the demand for loanable funds.
And we know exactly what happens when the demand for a limited pool of savings spikes. The price goes up.
The interest rate is driven higher.
This is commonly known as the crowding out effect. But through the lens of the Hayekian Triangle, we can actually see the physical mechanism of how it happens.
Because the government is willing to pay whatever interest rate is necessary to fund its deficit, the rate rises until the private sector is forced to abandon their long-term projects.
The time discount strikes again, but in reverse.
Right.
The high interest rate makes long-term investments mathematically unviable. The early stages of the triangle shrink. The entire economy is forced into a heavy bias toward present consumption and short-term projects.
And because we're investing less in the future, because we aren't building those new factories or researching new technologies, the overall growth rate of the economy slows down.
The burden of today's debt is mathematically shifted to the future. We are literally paying for the monument today by sacrificing the prosperity of tomorrow.
Now, this concept of shifting the burden brings up one of the most hotly debated theories in economics, which the text also addresses: Ricardian equivalence.
Oh, this theory is wild. It was actually championed in a very strong form by the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, the theory of Ricardian equivalence argues that if the government borrows $1 trillion today, citizens are smart enough to realize that borrowing simply equals future taxes.
So the theory goes, the citizens will perfectly calculate their personal share of that future tax burden, and they will automatically reduce their consumption today to save that exact amount.
Which would mean the government deficit has absolutely zero real effect. The government borrowing is perfectly mathematically offset by private saving.
But let's think about how absurd that is in practice.
Yeah. If Congress passes a massive deficit spending bill, nobody sitting at their kitchen table calculates their exact percentage of the national debt and immediately transfers $50 into a savings account to prepare for a tax hike 10 years from now.
And the source material strongly rejects Mises' view on this. Modern empirical evidence, and frankly, common sense, shows that human beings simply aren't perfectly forward-looking calculating machines.
We don't perfectly offset the borrowing with new savings.
Because we don't, the interest rate does rise, private investment is crowded out, and the structural burden truly is shifted forward to future generations.
Now, to be fair to the nuance in the framework, there is a slight difference if the government borrows money not for a monument, but for hard infrastructure.
Right. Let's say they borrow money to build a massive railway network to a new mining region.
In that specific case, government borrowing might actually expand the early stages of production.
It can act like a market entity trying to overcome a massive free rider problem, where a project is just too big for a single private company to coordinate.
But there's a massive catch here.
A huge catch. When the government builds that railway, it does so completely blindly. It isn't guided by true price signals, and it isn't guided by the actual SUFS, the genuine savings of consumers.
It's guided almost entirely by political allocation.
Exactly. So while it does expand the early stages of the triangle, it carries a massive risk of building a multi-billion-dollar railway to nowhere. It lacks the delicate internal balancing feedback of the unicycle.
And again, we're just exploring the mechanics outlined in the text. We are making a political judgment on infrastructure bills. But it shows how different tools impact the structure of production.
It really does.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? The next time you turn on the news and hear politicians from either side of the aisle promising to grow the economy, you now have a powerful mental model to decode what they're actually saying.
You can ask yourself a simple grammar question. Are they using the word grow as an intransitive verb or a transitive verb?
It's the perfect way to frame it. An intransitive verb implies the economy is naturally growing on its own.
Right. It's growing like a biological organism from the inside out, fueled by genuine savings, changing intertemporal preferences, and sustainable restructuring.
That's the unicycle balancing itself.
Exactly. But a transitive verb implies that a central planner is forcibly growing it from the outside.
They're grabbing the handles of the wheelbarrow and pushing it forward via artificially cheap credit, deficit spending, and ultimately malinvestment.
One leads to sustainable prosperity. The other usually ends in a tipped-over mess of a bust.
Well said. And before we go, there is one last genuinely surprising historical fact from the material that really stuck with me.
Oh, I know what you're going to bring up.
Yeah, when we think of free markets, natural liberty, and letting the unicycle balance itself, we usually think of Adam Smith.
The universally recognized father of modern economics.
Exactly. But Adam Smith actually supported usury laws. He advocated for strict government caps on interest rates, specifically targeting consumer loans.
Which seems like a massive contradiction to his entire philosophy.
It does. But his reasoning fits perfectly into this framework. Smith wanted to restrict the ability of everyday consumers to borrow money because he wanted to artificially force the available pool of savings into productive, long-term business investments.
He wanted to force the early stages of the triangle to expand.
It leaves you pondering a really profound tension. There is an inherent conflict between individual liberty, the freedom to borrow money just to consume a luxury good right now, and the desire to engineer long-term structural economic growth for the future of the nation.
It turns out even Adam Smith wrestled with the temptation to grab the handles of the wheelbarrow.
It really makes you rethink everything you see scrolling across that news ticker. The gauges might tell you how fast the machine is running today, but they won't tell you if the foundation is hollowing out underneath you. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the hidden architecture of time, money, and capital.